I'll never ask for anything else again. I swear, Mom. As kids, we've all said it at one point. We find something that seems like the most amazing item in the world, and we just have to have it, no matter what. For me, it was the newest handheld, a Game Boy Color. It was the most beautiful thing to a 6-year-old, especially when all my friends were getting theirs. Growing up with 4 brothers and sisters and not especially well off, my parents did their best, but we struggled to get by most of the time. They did their best to give us comforts and toys, but new electronics were out of the question. Well, we were still working off an old television that still used rabbit ears. I was the youngest of the 5 of us, so that meant a lot of hand-me-downs as well. I was used to it, but still held some resentment to my siblings and of course still begged for the Game Boy Color. They said they would do their best. Bless their hearts. Shortly after my birthday, my mom and dad presented me with a box. I was surprised, but they said they had found something they knew I wanted very badly, and I had been good. My heart raced with excitement as I tore into the box, but sank into the pit of my stomach. It was not a Game Boy Color. This poor excuse for a handheld was a badly abused original Game Boy. It looked like it had been bitten and melted by something in the corners, as well as stained. Up on top, a strange camera stuck out of the cartridge and inserted inside. When I picked it up, it read Game Boy Camera. They'd somehow managed to find it with the crappy little printer as well, complete with fading printer paper. You see? Daddy and I found it at a garage sale. It's exactly the kind you wanted. It even has a cool little camera to take pictures, they said, far more excited than I was. I'm not sure if it was the fact that this was the first thing had ever given to me first, and it was still someone's used piece of junk, or that they had no actual idea what I had wanted. Or maybe they had and just decided it was too much, so a replacement would suffice and I'd never know the difference. But in my utter disappointment, I threw the worst tantrum I had had since I was a toddler. I tossed the box on the ground and cried my eyes out, screaming how they were awful and I didn't want this. I wanted my Game Boy Color. Well, you can imagine how that turned out. I got a good whipping from my father in front of all my siblings and a long lecture on gratefulness and how hard they work. In punishment for my selfishness, they gave my gift to my brother Ryan, only a couple years older than me. I was so angry, and I didn't care though, and I was happy to be rid of the thing. Ryan, being the jerk he was, teased me about it endlessly. It was a few days after that he figured out the camera and started printing on it. He would tease me from his room, talk about how he got to play with the cool system, and I was too little and bratty to ever touch it. I would either yell back at him or slam the door to my room and ignore it. Shortly after, though, I heard him leave his room and call out to our mom, claiming that the printer was acting weird. She was busy making lunch and told him it was probably due to being used, and to keep trying and see if it would fix itself. I heard him go back into his room, then go back out a while later, saying it was probably busted and that he was going to his friend's house. Wondering what was wrong with it, I snuck into his room and found the papers lying on his bed. He'd taken photos of himself, making weird faces into the camera. The game system had been turned off as expected. The first few pictures were normal. Then they changed into strange faces that everyone knew about. The way the printer paper was stained, they looked even weirder. As I looked down at the later pictures, though, they looked different. Obviously, the camera in the game was not the greatest, so it was sometimes hard to see details of someone's face, or it would look blocky or blurry. The later pictures, however, seemed to change. It wasn't just scribbles or silly words written on the face. His features seemed to change, and there were dark spots around his eyes and mouth. His expression didn't look goofy anymore. Instead, it looked scared. Each picture seemed to change it more and more. Eventually, the pictures changed to where it didn't even look like he was holding the camera anymore, but that someone was taking the picture of him. He got farther and farther away, and what seemed to be a horrible story unfolded. It was showing Ryan running from the camera. The last picture was showing Ryan's face half missing. Dark pixels spilled out from the side of his head and lying on the ground. I didn't know what to think. I didn't even know the little camera was capable of things like this. It frightened me immediately, and I jumped from the bed and ran to my mom, telling her about the pictures. She didn't believe me and got angry as I was playing with it after my behavior. She scolded me and sent me back to my room. I was too nervous to be angry, though. I wondered what was wrong with that Gameboy and why it printed those pictures. I was immensely relieved when Ryan came back home that night for dinner. He seemed fine, and after that night I convinced myself it must have been a problem with the system, since it was beaten up so bad. Maybe some kind of error. At some point later in the week, Ryan tried again to take pictures. I heard him call it a piece of junk and then chuck it into his drawer. He threw all the pictures he had taken in a trash can. And I didn't think much of the Game Boy and the camera until a week later. I had been coloring in my room when I heard a terrible scream from outside and the sound of brakes squealing to a stop. Immediately, we all jumped up and ran outside to find out what happened, along with our neighbors. The sight that greeted us all still burned into a memory. Ryan had gone to walk across the street to his friend's house, just as he would any other day. A man had come speeding down the street and hit him. He'd been pulled under the car and his head half crushed under the tires as the man hit the brakes. My older brother's brain and skull was splattered under a pool of blood soaking into the street. I still remember the cry of agony and horror my mother let out, and the rage and grief in my father's eyes as he pulled the man from the car and shouted at him, asking why in the hell what he had been doing to hit a child. My sisters pulled me back inside, trying to comfort me and shield me from the sight, but the damage was done. It seemed exactly what the picture had shown me, and I knew that the Game Boy had been the cause. I tried to tell them, hoping they would believe me, but they didn't. And it made one of my sisters fall apart. The next few weeks were miserable. My parents were inconsolable. My mother could barely take care of the house and us. My eldest sister, Andrea, took over her role and struggled with it. angry with us and dealing with her own grief. She also took over cleaning out Ryan's side of the room that he shared with my older brother. At some point, she found the Game Boy and the Game Boy camera and asked if I wanted it. I told her it was cursed and that it had killed Ryan. She said that I was being cruel to our parents by turning their gift that was meant for me into a guilt trip, and that I needed to stop being so selfish. The funeral for Ryan caused even more money stress on the family, and slowly, even at a young age, I could see that they were not able to handle any of it. I did my best at that point to keep out of trouble and didn't say anything more about the Game Boy. I don't know when she took them, but at some point, I guess she needed a distraction from trying to hold up the house. I went into my sister's room to find a missing sock and thought maybe it had landed into her clothing. Her trash can had the same printer paper in it. An ice-cold sweat came over my body when I realized I couldn't stop myself. I reached in and looked at the pictures. They were the same. Andrea's face was slowly transformed into looks of horror and fear before showing her in a grotesque and terrifying position that I could only assume was a clue of how she would die. In the ending pictures, her face was barely recognizable, and her skin was black. I was definitely sure now. This thing had to be destroyed. I thought to myself that if I could destroy it, it could save my sister from the same fate. I tore her room apart, searching for the Game Boy. Eventually, I found it and the printer, and I held it in my hand as something chilling happened. It turned on. The screen flashed the logo before it began to make noises and music. The sound was wrong, as though it were being played backwards. I had been looking straight at it, and suddenly my face appeared on the screen. It began to print. In my panicked state, I went to shut it off, but found the button was down already. It should not have been running. I then proceeded to rip the printer paper out and the game out of the system. The Game Boy began to spark an error while the printer spewed out ink all over Andrea's bed. I felt it heat up in my hand and dropped it, watching the screen begin to smoke and the sparks fly out from both the Game Boy and the printer. After a minute or two, it seemed to die. Needless to say, I got in major trouble when my sister came home and found her bed sheets stained with ink and the system broken. My parents were furious and forbid me from going out with friends at all, as well as no TV. I was now considered very irresponsible and not allowed to touch any of my siblings' things. It didn't matter, though. I had saved her from a horrible fate, and the cursed system was gone. Or so I thought. I think back and realize that of everything I did, the thing that may have saved me was not letting the printer finish. 6 months later, my sister was killed when she was driving home and slipped on something in the road, crashing her car and being trapped inside as it caught fire. When the police came to my parents, they had told them she was burned beyond recognition, and the only reason they knew it was her because she was driving my dad's car. I couldn't save her. And I didn't dare tell my parents about the pictures. I don't think they would have believed me anyways. Years had passed and were grown up. My parents never really recovered from Ryan and Andrea's deaths, and they have struggled immensely. The three of us take care of them now, though we still have the old rabbit ear television for comfort's sake. There's still one thought that haunts me though, and makes it hard to sleep at night. I never found out what they did with the broken Gameboy and the camera and the printer. I pray to God every night the damn thing made its way into some trash compactor or is tangled with the plastic floating in the ocean. I fear that they still wanted it to have use and donated or sold it for parts. And someone somewhere is repairing it and putting in new paper. And they will see what it was trying to print of me.